I'm Dr. Jam Kothari.
And I'm Dr. Sally Moore. And this is a Myeloma Minutes, a podcast for people affected by myeloma, patients, friends and family.
Morning, Jam. Nice to see you. Here we are again, another podcast in. We're marching through the summer. It's baking hot. And I feel like I haven't spoken to you for a while. What's up? And any news?
Now, it's good to see you, Sal. The school holidays have started, which means just generally more chaos in our house. So it's nice to get back into the pod and record some new things that we're going to talk about today. And we've got a special guest today, which is really exciting.
Yeah, haven't we just? So we've got a really dear friend of ours, somebody who we've been working with for a number of years, Dr. Charlotte Paulin. We trained together, didn't we, Charlotte? And we did our registrar training when I was working in London. And you're still in London now, working at the famous Marsden Hospital, running your research laboratory, looking at how we treat and crack myeloma. But also, Charlotte, we're so delighted to have you on this podcast in particular because you are so active in designing the clinical studies which benefit patients in the UK and beyond. So it's a real privilege and a pleasure to have you with us today to have a chat about conferences, and particularly a lovely conference we went on recently to Stockholm, which sounds very glamorous, but we're going to talk our listeners through why on earth we do these things and what we get out of it. And you are going to gently guide us through, if that's all right. So lovely to have you here.
Thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me to join you on the podcast. I've heard so much about it. So I'm really happy to be part of an episode with both of you.
Charlotte, it's great to see you. The first time we met, I was thinking about this. I think it was probably about 13 years ago now. And I was a registrar and Charlotte was my SHO, believe it or not. So she was a couple of levels lower. And you go on a few years and now she's many levels higher. And it's great to have you on.
I definitely don't think that's true, Jam, but and you were an excellent teacher and trainer. So anything I managed to achieve was at least helped along the way by you as well.
It's nice to be working with you and seeing you at all these meetings. So it's been a busy what we call summer conference season. But I thought we'd start, Charlotte and Sally. It's like doctors of all sorts talk about I'm going to a conference, and often partners and friends and children roll their eyes, going, "Oh yeah, another conference, another jolly." In our field, in cancer, oncology, myeloma, what happens? What do we do? And of course, what do our patients get out of it?
So I think the main focus of conferences from my point of view is to hear about new and exciting data that's being reported out of clinical trials and other research, usually before it's published. So the outcomes of research that people are performing will hopefully eventually be published in a research paper that we can all read in a journal. But that process takes a reasonably long time to get to the point where that is publicly available. And so I guess for me, the primary purpose of conferences initially is to hear about new important data before it has reached that point so that we can hear about it from people running trials as soon as they have that data available.
So, I completely agree. It's so exciting, Charlotte, isn't it? And so often I come back from conferences and we go to quite a few, don't we? And I think we do ask a lot of our family and friends actually, because we're away so often. But what I find really useful is I go to a conference, I hear this often quite really exciting data, and then I can talk to my patients about that in clinic the next week and say, look, it's fantastic you're on this study because I've just heard that this might work for this period of time, or I know that when your disease comes back, this treatment option might be the right thing for you. Whereas had I not gone to that meeting, I may not have been quite so up to speed. And I think myeloma is incredible, I would say, in terms of the advances, but it's an awful lot to keep up with. And so actually every time we go away to a meeting, we just learn a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more. And that really, I think definitely translates into different outcomes on the ground day to day for our patients. But I don't know, Charlotte, Jam, would you agree that that's really what I get out of conferences, as well as all the other coffee and nice to go to Stockholm and all that kind of business? But that's really for me what's so important.
I really agree. And I think not only that data that you get that you can then talk to patients about, but also hearing how people who perhaps have more experience of a new treatment are managing side effects or other things associated with the drug, for example, how or where it can be delivered, moving treatments out of hospitals closer to patients' homes or in their homes, kind of learning from people about how they've managed to implement that in their hospital in their country, that we can then bring back to the UK and start to think about how to do that in our own local setup as well.
I think that's such an important point, Charlotte, because I think a lot of time people say to me, it's like you go to these conferences and you're hearing about all these fancy drugs. And it's just so different to what we can do on the ground day to day. But actually, you get updates of the slightly older drugs that you might use in a slightly different way. You get information about how a certain country is approaching a specific problem that is very relevant to, what we do. On top of the kind of the new fancy drugs, which we love, of course, there's that kind of, more day to day. Actually, we've used this drug for 2 years. We've shown, I don't know, for example, if you stop dexamethasone after 2 cycles, actually the outcomes can still be really good. So I think about getting those layers and talking to people from all over the world, Charlotte. I mean, you have sort of collaborations, throughout the world. So for you, that kind of speaking and working with people, across different parts of the world is extremely important.
Yeah, for me, that's very much a large part of what I'm doing at conferences is meeting with other people who are thinking about trials in other countries or could potentially help to support us running trials here in the UK to try and really build our trial portfolio for the UK in terms of accessing new drugs early, but also in terms of making sure that we're asking questions that are relevant for patients within the UK and are deliverable within the UK healthcare system, but also fit within that kind of international context.
Yeah, and just to add in there, Charlotte, 'cause I think that sometimes the concept of clinical trials is quite tricky for people to get their heads around. I don't know about you guys, but I think we still hear the idea of potentially being a guinea pig or experimenting on someone. And I think what's really important to explain, and I think, Jam, we spoke about this on our trials podcast, is for any trial to get anywhere near a patient, it has to be pretty robust evidence that it's going to, first of all, do good and not do harm. And also there's going to be a gain. And I guess when you're at these meetings in particular, Charlotte, given your role in developing trials, you're learning about building on the evidence to justify the trials so that you are confident it can be funded, but also that actually the answer, when you finally get the answer to a trial that drug X is better than drug Y, it stands a test of time. So that information gathering, building that knowledge is so very important, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that's really, really critical. We go through many steps and hoops and approval processes to get trials off the ground, whether those are trials that are sponsored or run by the pharmaceutical companies who've developed the drug in the first place, or whether those are trials that are designed, led and run by us as clinicians and the network of clinicians around the UK called the UK Myeloma Research Alliance design and run lots of trials that we think are important for patients that we've initiated, that we've kind of gone out there to try and set up. But yeah, whichever way we're going about it, those need to go through many regulatory hoops and processes to make sure that what we're doing is safe and ethical. And yeah, I think we also put a large value on trying to make sure that whatever we find, we can translate into the healthcare context within which we're working. So for us, that means thinking about how do we get from the end result of the trial to the nice approval of the new drug or approach or combination of drugs to be approved for funding on the NHS to be accessible to all patients around the country rather than just those who were involved in the trial itself.
I have to say, find it so useful speaking to people from other countries because you think that everyone does things in the same way, and actually you just spend a little bit of time, chatting around different people from Europe, the States, Australia, and it actually there's lots of slightly alternative ways of doing things that can still lead to very good, outcomes for patients. And we really do learn from our colleagues. And of course, reading papers, social media, all the other ways in which we can meet and learn is good. But there's, I have to say, there's nothing like face-to-face interaction. And I think we missed out on that during COVID. For the summer conference season, there's 2 main ones, right? So you have ASCO, this big American conference, which is in Chicago every year. I think it's in Chicago because I think it's one of the only cities that's big enough to hold the number of people, right? Because it's across all of cancer and you would never let a whole bunch of cancer doctors to go to a place like Las Vegas. So I think they decided that Chicago was the safest place. So there's that meeting, which I think some of us go to, but it's a bit far because only a couple of weeks later, it's the European Hematology Association conference, which this year was in Stockholm and we were all there. So we're going to talk about some sort of myeloma highlight from those 2 meetings.
Well, there's an awful lot to get stuck into because, as we've already said, things come through. There's so much research in this area, thick and fast. But I think there's some great abstracts. So abstracts are kind of the term that we use to refer to the summary of the trial. So there's these great summaries looking at lots of aspects of myeloma care, but I think the really interesting ones, which are going to ask really important questions of us as doctors and of our patients, revolve around smouldering myeloma. Should we treat it? That question is not going away. People keep on dabbling with treating smouldering myeloma. And there are a couple of studies that updated kind of what they found when they treat smouldering myeloma. There's a study which in particular was looking at a new tablet, which is like lenalidomide or pomalidomide, but maybe works a little bit differently, that is really exciting for us to hear about. There were updates on the bispecific antibodies, which we've spoken about before. So these are the drugs we can get in the UK, but we're using at fourth line. So when you've had 3 lots of treatment before and you need something else or beyond. The studies are looking at using them earlier and how well they fare. And then finally, the area which I think is interesting, which we haven't focused on the podcast, is amyloidosis. And I think it might be useful for us just to briefly signpost towards that, because we will be covering that in the future. But I don't think, because we haven't really gone into that in so much detail, maybe that's a lighter touch. But that's what I think would be interesting. But Charlotte, Jam, what did you think? I mean, there was so much to choose from.
I think there was a huge amount of data. And I guess just coming back to Jam's comment, the 2 meetings often do have some of the same new data being presented. So I think we are all fairly happy that we don't miss too much by going to the European meeting as opposed to the ASCO meeting. Often we get some slight spoilers before the meeting, so because the data is presented a few weeks earlier in the US, but it gives us a good opportunity to hear that data live in the meeting, but also to ask questions of the people discussing the trial and to kind of dig in from a European or a UK perspective on what that trial data means for us as well. But yeah, I think the areas you highlight are really the kind of key areas in which we had new and exciting data this year.
We've done a pod on smouldering, but we haven't gone a lot into the detail about it. But, logically and scientifically, there's a lot of reason to think about trying to stop the condition before it becomes symptomatic. What drugs were looked at, Charlotte, in the sort of the summer conferences with smouldering?
So I think the new data that was presented this year is around immunotherapy approaches for smouldering. So I guess so far we have seen previous trials looking at the tablet lenalidomide and the antibody drug daratumumab to treat smouldering myeloma. Those approaches are really aiming to prolong the time until a patient might develop symptomatic myeloma. They're not really trying to completely stop the process in its tracks to really prevent that from ever happening. Whereas I think that there's a hope with the immunotherapy approaches that we could be a little bit more definitive about trying to stop myeloma from, hopefully ever progressing, but at least making that time frame even longer. And so the studies that, or 2 of the studies that were presented look, for example, at the bispecific antibody therapies elranatamab and teclistamab. So drugs, as Sally mentioned, that we currently use in very much more heavily previously treated patients in the UK, approved at 4th line of therapy for myeloma, but now taking those drugs to try to use them early for smouldering myeloma. And I think for me, what they showed was really deep responses in patients, trying to prevent progression in patients and demonstrating that these kind of early reports clearly don't show us what's happening in the much longer term yet. And I think that's always the challenge in smouldering myeloma, is we need really long-term follow-up of patients within the studies to really know what the kind of longer term impacts of that intervention are. But I think, it's really great to see these really deep responses in patients with smouldering myeloma with immunotherapies. And that holds the hope that could be really impactful. And then I think what we're kind of looking at is trying to get away with hopefully maybe short periods of treatment to really mean that patients benefit from not having ongoing therapy.
What is the logic that drugs like these types of immunotherapies may work better the earlier the myeloma is? Because there is a sort of reasoned logic and some science to back that up as well.
These drugs rely on the patient's own immune system from being very active and being able to be engaged by these drugs to target the myeloma cancer cells. We know that with the therapies that we use for myeloma, unfortunately, they do have an impact on patient's normal immune system, as well as targeting the abnormal cells that we're trying to target. And so by the time we've got to fourth line of therapy for myeloma, for example, patients' immune systems have been through a lot. They've been damaged by the myeloma itself, but also potentially by the treatments that have been used in previous lines of therapy. And so the hope is that using these much earlier can harness the immune system whilst it's still kind of more operational.
And it's really important to say, Charlotte, isn't it? I mean, I think as we go to the next big international conference in the States and then next year at ASCO, there are going to be more and more studies coming through about smoldering myeloma. This is not going away. I mean, some groups are using all sorts of cocktails, aren't they, to try and tackle this area. And I think, as you said, really, maybe the ultimate goal is to completely stop myeloma in its tracks. And we're sort of nudging towards that. So I think this data, it just adds to the story. And so much of what we hear about at conferences just adds another layer to that story to help us understand what's going on. So it was great to hear about this abstracts and watch this space, really, hey?
I really agree. And I guess what we just need to wait for is that longer term data just before, I guess, maybe the listeners go away thinking around this being definitely something we should be doing. The process of trials, I guess, is that these are very much in the early phase of trials in terms of looking at relatively small numbers of patients with specific drugs and not yet comparing too much with many patients in a randomized fashion. We need a little bit more data, I think, for these drugs particularly before we can start to think about using them more routinely. And hopefully we'll see those trials come in over the next few years as well.
Alongside all of this, we're getting so much more data on the biology of smoldering myeloma and we should all appreciate, of course, that smoldering myeloma people don't have symptoms. So if you're going to treat, you want it to be as safe as it can be. But of course, eyes on the prize. If you can cure it with a short duration of tolerable treatment, clearly that is something that we should all think is a good idea.
100%. And it's just about making sure that we know what the side effects could look like. That's the challenge, I guess, for all of this, is balancing that real hope with making sure that we're careful in this, as you say, population of patients who don't usually have many side effects.
I think the three of us are all healthily cynical about smoldering myeloma. Maybe that's the way of putting it. But I mean, the thing is, we will explore this further on future.
It may change. We've got to keep open. I mean, as we learn, we change, don't we? So yeah, it's interesting.
We do. Every doctor does things 10 years into their career that they didn't think that they would do because they have been appropriately persuaded by, good data in trials that have been well run. Yeah. So absolutely.
And I think a lot of this also comes down to patients' perception around side effects, risks, challenges of treatment, as well as our own interpretation of all of those things. And at the moment in the UK, we don't have any treatments that are funded by NICE for smoldering myeloma. So our standard approach is still not to treat smoldering myeloma. But there are, in a number of centres, trials that are open looking at this very question in the UK at the moment. And so for patients who think, well, I really want that opportunity, then there are places, there are trial centres around the UK where trials are running to look at this very question. And so I think for the moment for us, it's not a question we're needing to discuss on a daily basis in clinic because we don't have that funded opportunity for patients for treatment. But the trials are there. So for patients who feel very strongly about treatment for smoldering myeloma, there's definitely something to discuss with their local doctor and talk about opportunities that are local or further afield to take that forward.
Sally, now you mentioned this drug that is a bit like lenalidomide and pomalidomide, which we've spoken about at length in the pod. And actually, we were contacted by one of our listeners in Australia. And I'll just read out his message and then we can get on to what we heard at ASCO. It's like, love the pod. Sorry, I had to get that back in. I'm wondering if you might address CELMoDs. I've just started a mezigdomide clinical trial here in Australia, and there's a shortage of easy to understand information on how this class of drugs work. So you responded very well. And actually, it's an opportune moment to talk about this drug, mezigdomide, and the data that was presented just a few weeks ago.
Yeah, amazing. Well, shout out to Australian friends and thank you so much for your feedback. And we honestly, questions. God, I sound like I'm on some cheesy talk show, but keep them coming in. Please do.
Exactly what this is, Sally. I don't really.
No, please, because that's how we know. That's how we know what's most useful. I mean, the names. I always go on about this, don't I? But this is a tough one, although it's got a nice abbreviation. So this is a drug called mezigdomide. I would suggest with all myeloma drugs to our listeners, have a run at it, mumble and say it quickly, and you'll pull it off. We call it Mezi for short. And as Jam has just said, it's a sort of like almost what we call next generation, which means that it's an improvement on what's gone before. And that improvement is an improvement on the type of drugs that we, the immunomodulatory drugs, which include thalidomide and lenalidomide. But because this drug works in a slightly different way, these class of drugs are referred to as cell mods. But I think the easiest way just for our listeners is it's almost like next generation lenalidomide or pomalidomide, but slightly different. And there's been studies going on looking at combining these cell mod drugs or mezigdomide, for example, with other drugs, again in the relapse setting, because that's where you have to prove something works best first, and seeing how well it does before, again, you can potentially use that drug slightly differently. So is this study presented at EHA, which was basically just showing how good this drug may have been when you added it to other drugs, which you use more frequently.
Thank you for listening to the Myeloma Minutes podcast, proudly partnering with Myeloma UK. For more credible myeloma-related material and support, please visit the Myeloma website at myeloma.org.uk. That's myeloma.org.uk. Or call the info line on 0800 980 3332, which you can find in this episode's description.
The drugs that are related to mezigdomide, so immunomodulatory drugs and cell mods, are the drugs that we study in my laboratory, and they're, for me, the most exciting kind of drug mechanism that we can try and use to treat patients. And the reason I think these are so exciting as drugs is they're a whole class of drugs that work as what we call protein degraders. And so what they do is target the normal waste disposal mechanism that we have in a cell. And they essentially target different proteins to be put through the recycling machine in the cell compared to what would normally be going through that process. And they do that by binding to a protein that leads to different target proteins being tagged and then targeted for what's called degradation, which is where that protein is put through a recycling machine, broken up into small pieces. And if we can target the proteins that really drive the growth of the myeloma cell to be recycled in this way, to be destroyed and broken down in this way, then that leads to the death of the myeloma cell, which is what we're aiming for with all of our treatments. They're really exciting drugs because thalidomide might be well known to people from the past, but it was discovered very serendipitously that thalidomide could be effective in myeloma. And it was only about 10 years ago that we discovered actually how it works, and that it works via hijacking this waste disposal pathway within the cell. And that has meant that going forwards, we're able to really think about how we could make these drugs better and be more effective. And that's how mezigdomide developed from the previous generations, by really understanding that mechanism, that biology of what's going on in the cell. And actually, I work with a team here in London who are now trying to hijack this pathway for other cancers. So it was discovered to work in myeloma, and we're now trying to hijack how it works to treat other cancers. And a recent drug was just approved by the FDA for the treatment of a type of breast cancer using this exact mechanism that we only learnt about through how we treat myeloma patients with this particular class of drugs. So for me, they're very exciting. They're protein degrading drugs. And the fact that we have this new, more potent version, the mezigdomide, compared to the previous generations, is we're starting to see the results coming out from trials like Successor 2 that was presented at the European conference, really kind of bringing us that data that supports these were rationally designed to hopefully be more effective, and we're starting to see that data come through now in these trials.
Just before we move on to those trials then, Charlotte, we often say, don't we, when we're treating people with myeloma, that when your disease comes back, if you've had treatment before, you should try something different. And And sometimes, patients might say, well, you're dealing with classes of drugs. Does that mean that if I've had, for example, lenalidomide, then that's my one shot at that class of drug? Or is it the case that particularly when you're dealing with a new treatment like mezigdomide, even when you've had lenalidomide and it stopped working, mezigdomide, for example, might still work? Is that what we're seeing in these studies?
Yeah, so there's good data to show that even patients who've had the immunomodulatory drug lenalidomide, or even lenalidomide and pomalidomide, can still have really good responses with these next generation drugs because they are working in a slightly different way, and therefore can overcome resistance to the previous generations of drugs if that has developed, and not all the patients will have become resistant to the previous agents anyway. So just in the same way that we would sometimes think about using, for example, carfilzomib, even if patients have previously had bortezomib, which are both proteasome inhibitor classes of drugs, then in the same way we can think about using the next generation of the CELMoDs, even in patients who have previously had the image drugs before that.
So the data that we saw, Charlotte, was mezigdomide combined with carfilzomib and dexamethasone, and certainly it looked quite good compared to just when you give carfilzomib and dexamethasone by itself. I think, I don't know what you both think about this. I think a really important thing to think about when we all look at data at myeloma meetings is that we often said, well, this combination controlled the myeloma for a year and a half, but this controlled the myeloma for 3 years. So sometimes people extrapolate that X might be better than Y, but every trial is quite different. And one thing I thought that was really good about the way they designed this trial is that actually, yes, you had to have been exposed to certain drugs and have relapsed myeloma before you're allowed on the study, but there was no limit to how many lines of treatment that you could have had. So it was really very inclusive, and so many of the other trials just limit it to patients who've had sort of 1 to 3, what we call lines of treatment.
Yeah, I think that was a really important feature of the design and a really important thing to consider. I think, as you were saying, when you're looking at trials, you're looking at the comparative outcomes for patients, but also, who was included? Was it representative of the kind of patients that we are treating on a day-to-day basis or not? And then for me, also, what were the side effects that patients were experiencing within each part of the trial with the different combinations? What, for that gain in hopefully patients' myeloma staying in remission for longer, what is the downside or the side effects that was seen alongside that? And I think that was something that struck me with this trial as well, was that although adding drugs together usually does lead to an increased percentage of patients having side effects within the study, and that was seen in this study, particularly for low white blood cells being experienced by patients. But one of the things about that side effect is that it's a test that we do and we tell patients about, rather than always something that they can feel. So it's still important that we know about it, but we can mitigate against it by using injections to boost white blood cells to try and prevent it from becoming a problem in terms of infection. So important to recognise that it's there and that we see that within the data, but that we can think about how we can kind of minimise the impact of that for patients.
Yeah, thank you. And for our UK listeners, there was a hope actually that this combination was going to be looked at by the approval body NICE, but that's now on hold. But we hope that this is a combination that can come to the UK, within a reasonable length of time, because certainly it will offer a different style of treatment. Charlotte, I think just briefly as well, there's a sister drug called iberdomide, and there was a little bit of data at the meetings on using this drug in a slightly different way as maintenance. Could you maybe just touch on that for us?
Iberdomide, again, is one of these kind of newer generation of the drugs that affect the waste disposal system within the cell, the protein degrader drugs, in lots of clinical trials at different parts of therapy, but most notably looking at the maintenance setting. So at the moment we use as standard the lenalidomide, a kind of original drug, as maintenance routinely, and thinking about whether or not the newer drugs could be used as maintenance more effectively and with fewer side effects for patients. We don't have all the data from those ongoing studies, so we don't know the kind of final answer from that yet.
It may be that at some point drugs like iberdomide could be used in the maintenance setting, but as you say, there's still more to come over the next few years. Right, Sal, should we get on to bispecifics?
Yeah, there's a lot to cover. I mean, we don't need to go into lots of detail, but it's just really exciting, isn't it, to hear that these drugs, as we said at the very beginning, being explored in smouldering myeloma. We've already got access to them in the UK. But there's a growing body of evidence. And in fact, Charlotte, is one of the studies that you've designed, which perhaps we'll speak to on a separate occasion. But there's a growing body of evidence that if you use these drugs earlier in the treatment pathway, and by that I mean when somebody perhaps hasn't had any treatment at all, or they've only had one line of treatment before, they might work even better. And so I think the studies which were presented at EHA really spoke to that. They looked at how you can use these drugs and compared them to how what we would call standard of care drugs, so drugs you might otherwise be offered, and how do they fare? Do they do better? Do they do worse? Do patients do just the same? So yeah, over to you, Charlotte. What did you think?
Yeah, so I think there's so much exciting data coming out about bispecifics. The data that we saw at EHA was mostly around kind of two key targets of bispecific drugs. So when we're talking about bispecifics, we're talking about molecules that bind to a patient's T cell, part of the immune system, and really kind of physically drag it close to the myeloma cell in order to enable the patient's immune system to kill off the myeloma cell. And it binds to the myeloma cell by two key proteins. One's called BCMA and one's called GPRC5D. And we have data that was presented at the conference about both of those different targets. So two different bispecifics and different trials looking at the different ways of targeting the myeloma cell. But I think for me, the big take home is that in the trials that we've seen so far, there is a really, really huge benefit in terms of prolonged remission time for patients receiving these bispecific antibody therapies compared to the standard of care option that was used within the trials. And that's within both the MajesTEC-3 trial, which looked at the BCMA drug targeting teclistamab, and also the Monumental-3 trial, which looked at targeting the GPRC5D protein. And so we're seeing more and more data from these trials and other trials as well as we go forward, really showing that they seem to have a really kind of big impact in terms of remission time.
They work better. They work for longer. And I guess the other really important thing that we're learning in day-to-day clinical practice is actually we're learning as we prescribe them in fourth line how to do it safely, how to modify the treatment so that the treatment is best tolerated. So the infection risk is lowered or the side effects are lower. And so actually when these studies, let's say in a couple of years' time, we're able to use these drugs because NICE approves them, we'll have so much more understanding about how you use them at second line as well. So I think the future for these drugs, and I don't know if you guys agree, not just relates to the number of people they work in and for how long, but also the fact that we're going to understand how to handle them better so that everyone's a winner.
Totally agree, Sally. I thought what was quite striking, though, and I think this speaks to your point, Charlotte, about your immune system and your T cells just being a bit better if you've had less treatments. Like, we know they work pretty well, all things considered, in the fourth line and so much better than what we had before. But those results, when you see the ones that have just been presented, are so much better in 1 to 3 lines. And of course, then what's really exciting is, well, when we get them in first line, if we can give them in the right way for the right length of time, we could be seeing, and we are starting to see that, we're seeing some sort of really game-changing results.
Yeah, I entirely agree. And I guess just coming back to our initial discussions at the beginning about, what is the benefit of going to conferences? One of the things that I've definitely learned from colleagues overseas as well as around the UK is how people are thinking about delivering these drugs. How can we try to start thinking about starting patients on treatment not in hospital at the moment? Patients are mostly in the UK coming into hospital to start their step-up treatment approach. But how can we start to think about moving that to being done more as an outpatient? And what other measures can we take to try and minimize the risk of infection? We talk about using using immunoglobulin replacement to try and minimize the risk of infections. And all of this are things we've learned not only from trials, but also from talking to other people about how they are doing that and how they're trying to modulate the treatment and the kind of administration pathway to make life easier for patients starting these treatments.
Totally. And I'm quite excited to get access to some of these drugs earlier because, we've seen that, when we've used them in the fourth line, sometimes, they don't work at all in about 30 to 40% of cases. And, we don't have all the science of that yet, but you just get a sense it's like their immune system is basically just given up and it just hasn't got the ability to get on top of things. And the way it's looking, it may be within a couple of years, guys, we may have teclistamab, as a second line treatment potentially available for people. And in some cases, we may be able to give that with daratumumab. Charlotte, I don't know if you saw that data where they looked at people with high risk myeloma and they kind of separated how these drugs might work. And I mean, just very broadly, it looked like what we are thinking is high risk myeloma appears to be sort of changing in lifetime. I don't know if you can speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of the biggest challenges we have at the moment in looking after myeloma patients is that we've seen outcomes for the vast majority of patients improve so dramatically, but we know that we're still kind of challenged by the group of patients who have what we call high risk myeloma, which means we can identify changes within their myeloma cell which make their myeloma harder to treat. And we can see, and we know that there are or have previously been kind of less well served by the new drugs because those changes just make their myeloma more challenging, more resistant and more difficult to get into remission. And I think one of the real great hopes of immunotherapies is that we could overcome that impact of those changes. And we're starting to see data emerge again. Obviously, we need longer follow-up to know what that looks like in the slightly longer term. But I think there is some great hope that we can at least ameliorate, so lessen the impact of that high risk state, even if we can't completely return their outcomes to normal. We're starting to see, that's very much the hope, and that's what I hope to see from these treatments and in the longer term. And I think we will get there potentially with maybe combinations with the bispecific therapies and other drugs to really see the loss of that impact from those high risk changes.
And that, I think, Charlotte, that's a really nice lead in for our last couple of minutes, really, just to briefly speak to amyloidosis. So we haven't spoken about amyloidosis on a podcast at all. It's a sort of, I call it a rarer sister condition. It sort of sits alongside myeloma, can sometimes go hand in hand with it, can sometimes do its own thing by itself, and can be really tricky to treat. But often the drugs that control myeloma can also work in amyloidosis. Now, like I said, we haven't spoken about this yet on the podcast, but we will do. But it was great to see that these newer, fancier ways, let's put it like that, of targeting myeloma might also be working for this even rarer condition. And I also think that's really exciting. And you mentioned that earlier, didn't you? The cell mods, your area of expertise, the mezigdomide class of drugs, are now being used in different cancers. And equally, it's great to hear the myeloma drugs are being used and to good effect by the looks of it in a rarer myeloma-related condition, amyloidosis. So lots of hope, even for those patients who don't have the more common, dare I say it, myeloma, which we deal with day to day.
Yeah, I think really exciting to see data from the bispecific antibodies in amyloidosis and patients who often suffer with significant challenges because the amyloid affects many organs throughout the body, most commonly kidneys and the heart. But that can really lead to challenging experiences for patients in terms of the effect of the disease. So if we can do something to stop that, to stop the damage that the amyloid causes to those organs, then that's fantastic. And the hope is that some of these more powerful myeloma drugs will have an impact in amyloid as well. And we can see that from the data that we're starting to see coming through.
If we fast forward a bit, we've done a lovely summary, Charlotte, of what we've seen and has sort of captivated us at ASCO and EHA. Is there anything you're looking forward to? There's a big meeting in December, the ASH meeting. I'm sure your team and your your group has got some work that we'll be looking forward to seeing. What are you looking forward to seeing later in the year?
So yeah, super excited about ASH, which happens in December, the American Society of Haematology meeting. But before that, we have the International Myeloma Society meeting, which for the first time in a long time is coming to the UK. And so is happening in Glasgow, which is fantastic for us as UK myeloma doctors and the UK myeloma community more widely. There's a whole allied health professional day that happens at the beginning of the IMS meeting, as well as 4 days of meeting about myeloma, precursor conditions and amyloidosis during that time as well. That it will be attended by many, many doctors, nurses, pharmacists, everybody interested in looking after myeloma patients, as well as patients themselves. There are lots of patient advocates that will often attend these meetings as well. So yeah, really excited to see data coming out from IMS in Glasgow.
And actually, Charlotte, that is another it's like you're a professional. That's another beautiful lead in to the fact that the IMS, which is this incredible conference, is a lot of fun, but my God, the learning is amazing. Jam and I will be doing interviews with experts. So as I said before, keep your questions coming in. Please, 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 because any questions that you guys, our listeners, want to ask, we might then be able to ask directly to members who are attending at the meeting. So really looking forward to doing really unique Myeloma Minutes kind of like content for our listeners at that conference. So watch out for that, guys.
No, it's very exciting that it's coming to the UK. It's so exciting. I didn't even mention it and went straight to December. So it's like, but actually, I mean, how could we forget? I think it's a real opportunity for, all of myeloma on one side, and also to really, I think, showcase the significant contribution that the UK has made to, myeloma treatment and clinical trials over many decades. So we're very excited for that. Charlotte, thank you so much for spending some time with us this morning. Like, honestly, I think we could have spoken for at least another hour, but please come back soon. You're literally just starting in a really exciting first-line clinical trial for patients with immunotherapies, and we would love to talk about that in some detail a bit later in the year.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm delighted to be part of the podcast, and thanks to everyone who listens to Myeloma Minutes. Keep listening.
Thank you. Bye, guys. Have a lovely day.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
This has been the Myeloma Minutes. We hope you found this week's pod engaging, interesting, and above all, understandable and genuinely useful. If you enjoyed today's episode, please follow the podcast and share it with anyone who might benefit, from your online support group, your medical team, to friends and family. And as always, if you have questions or topics you'd like us to cover in the future episodes, please do get in touch. You can find us at www.themyelomaminutes.com or email us at themyelomaminutes@gmail.com. And you can find us on social media by searching The Myeloma Minutes on Instagram and Facebook. Many thanks for listening, and we'll see you at the next one.